storing hashed passwords in the database, then you want to actually hash it first. So it looks something like this. So we say, we define this method, that's the logic, and we say, okay, if password exists, then I'm going to get the select object, and then I'm going to use that, and I'm going to pass it the username, and then I'm going to pass it the hashed version of the password. If it doesn't find anything, then you just die, and again, that exception would be stored as a class attribute. Inserts, updates, deletes are really simple. You call it insert, and then just pass it a hash of values. It'll create a new row. You can also do multi-row inserts. There's an insert many method, and it'll return all the rows it creates if you want them. Updates, again, very simple. You just call update, pass it a hash of values, and delete, call delete. And like I said, Fey ORM is entirely based on Moose, so if there's any Moose feature, you can also use it just as you would normally. So we have, again, our Fey ORM table. It exports all of the stuff that Moose exports. So we have has, and we can say has reverse title, and the default is based on the title attribute, which we're getting from the database. You can also use roles, just like you would with anything else. You can use method modifiers. You can also use pretty much any Moose X module. So if there's an extension, like say, well, Moose X strict constructor probably isn't too useful for this, but Moose X class attribute or Moose X branch validate, those are two I end up using a lot. I don't know that you could use Moose X declare. I'd probably need to come up with some sort of Fey ORM declare to make that work. I also mentioned iterators. So whenever you do a select that's going to return multiple rows worth of stuff, it gives you an iterator instead of creating everything in memory and then returning an array or something like that. It's using DBI statement handles kind of behind your back, and then every time you fetch the next row, it inflates it into an object for you. So you can also return multiple objects. So you can have an iterator that, say, got an album and its tracks simultaneously. So some ORMs kind of either don't allow you to fetch multiple objects at once or make it kind of hard, so you can't basically optimize your queries. And particularly, like, I think Class DBI was really bad about this. Basically, you'd be iterating over one set of objects, and then every time you got like the related one, it would do another select. So it should have been a single select could easily turn into, say, 1,001 selects, which got really ugly for your database. You can also use Fey SQL in your model classes to build any sort of complex query that you want. So here's an example of a custom select. So we get the schema object. First we make a select. We get the schema object in the track table. So we're going to select everything from the track table where the album ID equals blah, blah, blah. Has been played as 0, ordered by column title. And then we can just use that select here. So we're going to get the unheard tracks for the album. So myself equals shift. We get the select, get the database handle, and then we create a new iterator. We tell it what classes it's going to be returning. We pass it the select it's going to use. We pass the database handle and the bind frames. So this would be a way to create methods in your class that return some sort of arbitrary data related to the object at hand. You could also use this to create class-level methods that would return data related to all of the albums. I mentioned there's an object caching system. Basically, if you turn it on, it caches the results of just calling new. And so you can enable it for all of the table-related classes. And basically, so we call my schema user new, pass it user ID 42. We do that again, and these two objects are the same. If we clear the cache and then call a new yet again, this object will differ from these two. This is a really, really stupid cache. If you want to clear it, you have to clear it yourself. When I wrote Alzabo, I wrote these enormously complicated synchronizing cache classes that would even synchronize caches across multiple processes and potentially across multiple machines. It was a work of great genius. And what I realized is that all the logic to do all this synchronization was significantly slower than not doing any caching at all. So there was a really good lesson there. And when I wiped it all out and I replaced it with a really dumb in-memory cache that I had to manually clear, and it sped up my code by quite a bit. Generally, what I do is if I'm doing a web app, I'll just call clear at the beginning or the end of each request. So during a request, if you try to fetch the same object twice, you get it out of the cache. That's a nice little speed up. It's also nice because that way if we update this user object sees it, which is what you want, and then you just clear it. And it's really stupid and simple, and it works really nicely. Unfortunately, I think as programmers, we've all experienced these moments of self-defeating cleverness. You're just like, and I was really wrapped up in it. I just was like so excited when I got it all to work, and then just so sad when I realized how useless it was. Of course, it supports transactions. This is done with the schema class. So a transaction is just a subroutine reference, and then you just call this run in transaction method, pass it to it. It will kind of fake nested transactions for you if your database doesn't support it. Basically what that means is it won't try to begin a transaction inside another transaction unless your database allows it. So you can call run in transaction inside a transaction and it just works, but you don't actually get nested transactions. You just don't get an error, which is as good as I can do. In general, it tries to be efficient as possible. It really tries to minimize SQL queries. So for example, if it needs to fetch like one column's worth of data, it will fetch all the columns that it hasn't already loaded. One thing I do need to add is an explicit don't load this until needed list. For example, if you have like one column in your table that happens to be a large blob and you only need it, say, 10% of the time, you probably want to delay loading that particular chunk of data. That's something I haven't yet added, but I don't think will be terribly hard to add. Generally, just because, again, it's kind of a more SQL-y ORM, it tries to be efficient. It gives you a lot of control over exactly what queries are being executed. In general, you're never going to be very confused about what operations are going to execute a query and what won't. I found that with some ORM, you're never quite clear. It's so magical that it's not always clear what actually triggers a call to the database and what doesn't. It also has a full introspection layer for all the attributes and methods it creates. For example, it creates an attribute per column for every column in your table, and you can introspect all those, and you'll know that they came from columns. When you do the inflate-deflate stuff, that's introspectable. All of the has-many and has-one relationships are introspectable. And like Moose, it would be extendable via its meta API. Nobody's written any extensions, that's why I say it would be. But you could use the same techniques that you'd use to extend Moose to extend Fey ORM. It would just be a case probably of applying roles to the meta classes to add new features. And that should just work. Of course, I say that, and then somebody will try it, and they'll find all the bugs that make this not work. But I'll fix it. It's still not done. I'm still kind of just using it for my stuff. I suppose if anybody else uses it, that'll probably help me understand more of what it needs to do. I expect it to expand. One thing that's there's not a lot of is any sort of per DBMS stuff. I've tried to keep it as agnostic as possible, but eventually there'll need to be a little more database-specific stuff. Somebody wrote Fey SQL PG, which adds a few things that Postgres needs. Somebody might, if they were stuck using MySQL and couldn't find any way to quit their job, or couldn't commit suicide because it's too painful, they might want to write a Fey SQL MySQL class that would, for example, say support replace queries. And if you're stuck using Sybase like I am, well, we're never going to use any modern Perl tools if I want, so it's not an issue. I could also imagine the ORM needing some sort of per DBMS support. There's a hack in there for Postgres right now, but really nothing else that's per DBMS. There's also this Fey ORM mock distribution. I originally wrote it because I don't know if anybody's ever used DBD mock, but it's got a horrible API and it's really fiddly. And it's really hard to actually use it effectively. With Fey ORM mock, you can operate at kind of a higher level and basically seed data for an upcoming query in your tests, and you can also track all the insert, update, and deletes that are executed, and it doesn't actually touch any sort of database. It's a lot easier than DBD mock, but it doesn't let you do as much as DBD mock does either. So basically you can do something where you kind of create a mock object for a schema class, and then you can seed data for a class like the album class, and just like seed a bunch of rows that will be constructed next time there's some sort of query against this table. You can also, you do an insert and a delete, doesn't actually touch the database, and then there's this recorder, and you can ask for all the actions that touched a particular table related to a class. It's kind of useful. I originally thought I'd use it a lot more than I actually have. And what I found is that ultimately, if I'm doing any sort of real application, there's just no substitute for writing tests that actually just hit a test database. Ultimately, especially if you're using any sort of features like triggers in the database or stored procedures or whatever, you really want to test the full back and forth cycle. Testing your classes in total isolation from the database really kind of leaves you open to a lot of bugs. But I think it would be useful certainly for doing maybe a subset of tests that you could do more quickly and maybe run those repeatedly and then reserve the interaction with the test database for your maybe continuous integration server or something like that. So it's useful, but not quite as useful as I wish it could be. What I really want is a Perl module that would make Postgres run about 10,000 times faster, and then all my tests would be really quick. If anybody writes that, let me know. If you want to learn more, probably the best place to come for help is Fey on irc.perl.org. It's a really quiet channel, but I'm in there all the time, and a few other people who use Fey are also in there. You're welcome to ask questions about Fey or Fey ORM, or really anything else. You can ask a question about anything. You're most likely to get an answer if you ask something related to Fey. There's a mailing list I made, but it has no traffic, so you might as well use IRC. There's this website that has basically nothing but a set of pointers to the repository in the IRC channel, and that's really it. And that's pretty much it for the presentation. Are there any questions? Anyone? It's okay to ask questions. Yes?
Fey and, what was it, Azavo?
Azavo, yeah.
Why are they called that?
Okay, so Azavo is called that because I'm quite a big fan of the author Gene Wolfe, which is why, for example, my email address is autark@earth, spelled U-R-T-H. Is it anybody else read Gene Wolfe? A bunch of uncultured illiterates. Oh my God. Anyway, it's a really interesting, weird science fiction author. So I'm a big fan of his, and in one of his books he has this creature that's called the Alzabo that when it eats people, it retains their memories and mimics their voices and uses that to lure out its family to eat them as well. And that it's actually even more complicated than that, so my idea was that Alzabo was kind of a tool that ate your database and mimicked it in Perl. And Fey is called that. There's an explanation in the pod. It was like a long, like random stream of consciousness set of thoughts that started with like SQL and ended up at FEY. So anyway, any other questions? Like, where might you find Gene Wolfe books? What should you read? I would strongly, I'm glad you asked that. I would strongly recommend that you read his cycle of 5 books called the New Sun books. And the first one is called Shadow of the Torturer. Excellent books, highly recommended. Any other questions that I can make up for myself? How did I get to be so good-looking, handsome, and intelligent? Excellent question. I don't really have time to go into that. I don't know. What can I say? Observe and imitate. That's a real question. Yes.
What would be a really good fit for Fey ORM?
What do you mean, like a type of application, or?
Yeah, what would be from the DBX class?
I think the primary difference in choosing DBX class versus Fey ORM is not the application, it's the developer.
Okay.
So it's like, if you like the way DBX class does things, use it. You know, there's nothing wrong with it. It's well supported, it's been around a long time, it's got lots of great features. You know,